I'm going to compare and show you every difference between the iPhone 14 Plus and the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Welcome everybody to Apple Insider. It is Andrew here, and you can find me on Twitter at Andrew_OSU. The iPhone 14 Plus is now available. When Apple launched the iPhone 14 lineup, it did it without the iPhone 14 Plus. iPhone 14, iPhone 14 Pro, and the iPhone 14 Pro Max were available, but the Plus model was delayed until October. But that time has finally come. I've got both of these in my hand. I've been testing them out, I've been benchmarking them, and I'm going to walk you through every difference between these two phones and give you an idea if it's worth it to go from a 14 Plus to a 14 Pro Max, or if you should stick with a more budget-friendly option. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Let's start by talking about the design of these two phones. Apple has historically kept a material difference between its entry-level models and its Pro models, and that holds here as well. So for the iPhone 14, it's made out of machined aluminum, which has a matte finish to the exterior and a glossy glass back. The colors also tend to be more pastel-like. For the Pro model, Apple has a deeper color set, and it uses a stainless steel frame instead of aluminum. This is stronger, but it's also significantly heavier. Holding the devices in your hands, you're definitely going to notice the increased weight on the Pro Max versus the iPhone 14 Plus. Additionally, that stainless steel frame has a glossy edge to it and the matte glass back. By the way, since we're talking about these backs right now, the iPhone 14 Plus and the iPhone 14 have a much more easily repairable glass back, so if this ever breaks, it's much easier to replace this than on the Pro models. Both iPhone 14 Plus and iPhone 14 Pro Max leave out the SIM card tray. Apple has moved to eSIM only this year, at least here in the US. We'll talk about the cameras more in depth in just a moment, but obviously, talking from a design standpoint, the iPhone 14 Pro Max has a much larger camera bump than the iPhone 14 Plus. One of the primary differences between these two devices is going to be the displays. They each have a very similar resolution and pixel density. Looking just at resolution and pixel density, they're nearly indistinguishable, and they're both OLED displays. But the iPhone 14 Pro Max has several unique features to it. For example, it's a Pro Motion display, meaning it can go all the way up to 120 Hz dynamically based on what you're doing. Scrolling, playing a game, it can bump up that refresh rate and other times slow it down. The iPhone 14 Pro Max is also a much brighter display. For just typical indoor usage, the iPhone 14 Plus is at about 800 nits of brightness, but the iPhone 14 Pro Max is at 1000 nits of brightness. When viewing HDR content, iPhone 14 Plus can ramp up to about 1200 nits, whereas the iPhone 14 Pro Max can get all the way up to 1600. But the iPhone 14 Pro Max can go even further. When you're outside in bright sunlight, it can get up to standard brightness, or peak brightness rather, of 2000 nits. It's incredibly bright when you're outside in the sun, making it far more usable outside. But there are other differences with the display as well. The iPhone 14 Plus still has the notch where it houses Face ID. The iPhone 14 Pro Max has the new dynamic island. It's 30% smaller and sits down a little bit more, but it's also interactive. You can see notifications from different apps and system settings. You can see your music that's playing and live activities. You can see when Face ID or your AirPods connect. All of this can be shown inside a dynamic island, and it's going to get more powerful as third-party developers start to take advantage of it starting in iOS 16.1. Finally, the iPhone 14 Pro Max features an always-on display. That Pro Motion display that can ramp up to 120 Hz can also drop down to as low as 1 Hz, which is 1 refresh per second. This can definitely help on battery life, but allows you to have the display on all times, so you can see what's going on your phone without ever having to touch it or pick it up. Before we get too far into this review, I have to thank my sponsor for this video, Journey. Journey makes incredible accessories for all of your Apple gear. Whether you're looking for MagSafe chargers, whether you're looking for Apple Watch straps, whether you're looking for AirPods cases, or maybe you need some awesome new cases for your iPhone 14 Pro, they have you covered. Their new iPhone 14 cases are better than ever. They're using full-grain European leather that ages over time and develops a gorgeous, rich patina that's unique to you the more that you use it. has raised cutouts around the camera and the screen to protect both of those, and has new machined metal buttons on the side that look gorgeous and give an amazing tactile feel that many leather cases do not have. They have a slim profile that fits good in your hand but still is very protective, has a microfiber lining to cradle your iPhone, and of course it is both Qi and MagSafe compatible, so you can use all of your favorite MagSafe accessories with your Journey case. If you'd like to check out any of Journey's accessories, there's a link for them down below in the description. Thank you again to Journey for sponsoring this video. Apple kept a variation of the A15 Bionic processor in the iPhone 14 Plus, but the iPhone 14 Pro Max has the new A16 Bionic chip. Let's see how these two differ in terms of Geekbench and performance benchmarks. On standard Geekbench 5, the iPhone 14 Plus scored a 1722 and the iPhone 14 Pro Max scored an 1862. On the multi-core test, the iPhone 14 Plus scored a 4349, whereas the iPhone 14 Pro Max scored a 4775. These have the same number of cores for the CPU, so we can see that improvement on the single core, which then carries over to the multi-core test. Had the iPhone 14 Pro Max contained additional CPU cores, we'd see an even bigger jump on the multi-core test. But alas, that's not the case this year. Both chips use a 5-core GPU, but we got a big difference on the iPhone 14 Pro Max this year. The iPhone 14 Plus scored a 12,354, whereas the iPhone 14 Pro Max scored an impressive 15,424. Big graphic gains for the iPhone 14 Pro Max, especially considering that the iPhone 14 Plus has an additional GPU core compared to the iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 mini. Finally, we look to the Antutu benchmark. We saw a 781480 on the iPhone 14 Plus and 894348 on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. The biggest gains here were in memory and the GPU performance, though of course the CPU and the UX both saw their own gains as well. Then we have the cameras. Apple did a lot this year with the cameras. So if you want to know more of the differences from the iPhone 14 and iPhone 14 Pros compared to the 13 and 13 Pros, check out those dedicated videos. But for now, let's talk about how these two differ. The iPhone 14 Pro Max has 3 cameras, a 48 megapixel wide-angle lens, a 12 megapixel ultra-wide lens, and a 12 megapixel 3x telephoto lens. Comparatively, the iPhone 14 Plus only has 2 lenses, a 12 megapixel wide-angle lens and a 12 megapixel ultra-wide lens. When you're using these cameras, both will have support for 0.5 times optical zoom, which is that ultra-wide lens. Both will have the 1x zoom, which is your standard wide-angle lens, but only the iPhone 14 Pro Max has the 2x optical level zoom and 3x telephoto zoom. Additionally, the iPhone 14 Pro Max gets up to 15 times digital zoom, whereas the iPhone 14 Plus only has 5 times digital zoom. Even though the iPhone 14 Pro Max has much better cameras with that 48 megapixel sensor, the iPhone 14 Plus still has upgraded cameras over the iPhone 13 series. Apple did include a new, larger wide-angle sensor, and they each have improvements such as the photonic engine and Apple's improved low-light performance thanks to the updated A15 Bionic ISP. Both cameras now support cinematic mode at 4K resolution at 24 or 30 frames per second, and both support the new action mode that can support 2.8K footage that's been highly stabilized, kind of like using a gimbal, but it's built entirely into your phone. One more difference between the two, the iPhone 14 Pro Max has support for Apple ProRAW photos and Apple ProRes video. There's no RAW or ProRes support on the iPhone 14 Plus. For connectivity, both iPhone 14 Plus and iPhone 14 Pro Max support nearly the same thing. They each support 5G, have support for Wi-Fi 6, and the newfound Bluetooth 5.3. They also each support NFC, MagSafe, and Apple's U1 ultra-wideband chip. They also now support new features, including emergency SOS via satellite that'll be arriving later this year. And they each can call emergency services if you're ever in a car crash. Let's wrap this up with storage and color options. Both the iPhone 14 Plus and iPhone 14 Pro Max come in 128 gig, 256 gig, 512 gig configurations, though the iPhone 14 Pro Max has an additional 1 terabyte option that you can take advantage of. And when it comes to colors, the iPhone 14 Pro Max comes in silver, space black, gold, and this new deep purple color. The iPhone 14 Plus, on the other hand, comes in midnight, which is kind of a dark black color, starlight, which is a soft white, little bit goldish tint. There's also a product red version, there's a new blue color, and this new purple option. iPhone 14 Plus starts off at $899, $900 here in the US. The iPhone 14 Pro Max, on the other hand, starts off at $1099, $1,100. So there's essentially a $200 price difference between the entry-level iPhone 14 Plus and iPhone 14 Pro Max. So what's the big things that you get for that $200 if I had to summarize everything in this video? Well, you get that brighter, always-on display with the dynamic island. You also have the new, improved, faster A16 Bionic processor that's going to ensure your phone lasts even longer into the future. And the iPhone 14 Pro Max has the big, new upgraded camera with a 48 megapixel primary sensor and telephoto zoom capabilities. For me, for a $200 price difference, that's a good deal. There's a lot of benefits to that iPhone 14 Pro Max, but pricing can get out of hand quickly. If you up that storage even a little bit on the iPhone 14 Plus and Pro Max, even though there's still only a $200 difference, it's costing you quite a bit to get to an upgraded model of an iPhone 14 Pro Max. If you're looking for primarily just that bigger display and want to save some money, you can easily go for the upgraded iPhone 14 Plus and still feel good about it. It's definitely a good phone, and this is the first time in years that Apple has offered a non-Pro plus-sized phone. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments or over on Twitter at Andrew_OSU. If you have any questions, let me know as well. If you want to pick up an iPhone 14 Pro Max or an iPhone 14 Plus, there are links down below in the description. Otherwise, stay tuned. I have a lot more videos coming your way.